Good morning. I want to invite you to turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 2. We will be there in a few minutes. Before we get there, I want to take a quick poll and hear what your favorite thing is about the Christmas season. So just shout some things out. Somebody tell me, what's your favorite thing about the Christmas season? Food. People doing silly things. What else? Presents, Christmas lights, decorating, family. Somebody in first service said, when it's over. Yes, can some of you resonate with that? Yes. Well, I can feel that sometimes. I enjoy, though I think my favorite thing, besides, what Christmas means, and family and all those things, I think for me, I love looking at Christmas lights. Beth and I, on our first date, went to a Christmas party. Some friends from college were getting together, and we were at the home of one of our friends. And after that, we drove around for 2 hours and talked and looked at Christmas lights in Lubbock, Texas. It was a magical evening. It was the first of a very special story. And so I enjoy doing that still to this day, driving around and seeing Christmas lights. Over the years, though, this has gotten a little ridiculous, right? The world has kind of gone Clark Griswold on us, for you Christmas Vacation fans. Clark Griswold spends the whole movie trying to get this magnificent light display on his house to come up, and it won't work. And then it finally does come on, and nobody sees it until the end. Just so classic. But people, this has gotten a little bit out of hand because some people, the only thing greater than their light display is their electric bill for the month, right? So here are some magnificent Christmas light displays that I found online that you just look at and think, wow, that is so cool for us to look at. I bet you had fun putting that up or paying someone to put that up. It's crazy what people will do, but we love Christmas lights. We love looking at them. Some of these, they're like coordinated to music. They have their own radio station. Just tune in to 92.7 and you can listen to the music coordinated with it's awesome. It's so fun. Christmas is full of light. Jesus is the light. Advent celebrates the coming of Jesus, the light, into the world. And celebrating that light is like celebrating the resurrection at Easter. We know how the story goes. We live on the other side of the story now, and we can look back and see everything that was happening and say, man, wasn't that great? Jesus was born into the world, and then at the resurrection, Jesus is raised from the dead. And yet Easter and Advent both share something in common. And it's that you can't fully understand and experience the goodness and celebration of these two seasons if you skip over all the dark stuff and all the hard stuff that happens to get there. Sometimes with Easter, we want to skip the horror of the cross so that we can get to the empty tomb. And oftentimes at Christmas and Advent, we skip over all of the stuff going on in our race to get to the manger where baby Jesus is there, born as the light of the world. And our culture doesn't help. Our culture cultivates in us this desire to just be happy all the time. But for most of us, that's not always authentic to where we actually are. And for those of you who act that way, you drive the rest of us crazy. You drive us nuts. Because life's not always light and happy and fun. Tish Harrison Warren just wrote an article in the New York Times where, among other things, she says that we suffer from a collective consumerist mania that demands we remain optimistic, shiny, happy, and having fun. But, she says, abstaining for a moment from the clamor of compulsive jollification and instead leaning into the reality of human tragedy and of my own need and brokenness allows my experience of glory at Christmas time to not only feel more emotionally sustainable, but more vivid, vital, and cherished. I think what she's saying is that we can't fully experience the joy of Christmas of Jesus, the light, coming into the world until we acknowledge and face the darkness out of which that light is born. And so for the next 4 weeks, we'll be in this series called Christmas in the Dark. The light is near. It's tempting to skip the dark parts because we don't like the dark. And yet there are some things that we can only learn in the dark spaces of our lives. In pain and suffering and disappointment and doubt and loss and in waiting. Many of you can testify to this. Some of you have several Christmases under your belt. And you can testify that sometimes God has done God's most important work in your life in seasons that were difficult. For all of you optimists in here, don't worry, Christmas is still coming. I know that you're like, really? This is what we're doing for the next 4 weeks? That's the most depressing thing of all time. But I promise, Christmas is still going to come. The light is still going to be there, and we are going to get there. Just a quick disclaimer. I know that often darkness is used in Scripture and in our world as a metaphor for evil and for death and for sin. And that's not what we're talking about in this series. When we're talking about darkness over these next 4 weeks, we're talking about the hurt and the suffering and the pain and the doubt that we experience in the difficult places. But this series is going to challenge us to ask the question, what might God want to do in me when I feel like I'm in a dark place? What can I learn in the dark spaces of life? Some of you may be familiar with church traditions that light Advent candles for the 4 Sundays in Advent. Maybe you grew up in a tradition that does that, or you've done that before. Typically, what happens is each week you light an additional candle, and you get to Christmas Day and you light a 5th candle, the Christ candle. And those candles in different traditions symbolize different things, but a lot of times they symbolize themes like joy and hope and love and faith. But this season, as Taylor already mentioned this morning, we're going to look at the opposite side of those Advent candles, and we're going to be exploring what it means to experience waiting and doubt and grief and loneliness. And today we're going to focus on waiting. We all know what it's like to wait. When you're a kid, you wait for Christmas. Those packages may be getting wrapped and put under the tree, and you ask your parents, I just really want to open a present right now. And they say, you can't, you have to wait. And every single one of us who experienced that felt the exact same thing in that moment. I don't like to wait. We don't like waiting. We want what we want, we need what we need, and we want it sooner rather than later. And that brings us to our text from this morning, Luke chapter 2, which zooms forward. We're after now the part in the story where Jesus has already been born, and Jesus' parents bring him to the temple to do the religious rituals that were required of them. And so in verse 25 of Luke chapter 2, it says this, Now there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed and a sword will pierce your own soul too. And there was a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Penuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband for 7 years after her marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. I love these two characters, Simeon and Anna. We don't know anything else about them other than what's mentioned here in Luke chapter 2. But we know that they represent this idea of waiting. They were waiting and longing for God to show up, for God's Messiah to be born, and for them to see God's light coming into the world. And they represent the hope of the people of Israel in the first century who were waiting for God to show up and restore and redeem and forgive. For almost 600 years, since the destruction of the temple in 586 BC, the people of Israel had waited in exile, waiting for God to give them any sort of sign, any sort of signal that he was back on their side, that they were okay, that their relationship had been repaired, that what God was going to forgive them, and that they were going to reclaim their heritage to be a light to the nations, and there had been no sign. In fact, for the last 400 years, up to the point of the birth of Jesus, God had not made a peep. Not one sound. Not a word spoken through a priest. Not a word of the Lord given through a prophet. Silence. And so God's people waited, wondering if God would ever show up. And they were in the dark. And they were waiting. What were they waiting for? If you look back through the prophets, you'll find in several places described what God's people were waiting for God to do. And I love how Isaiah puts it in Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 3. And then we'll skip down to 18 and go through 61, verse 7, where it says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. No longer will violence be heard in your land, nor ruin or destruction within your borders. But you will call your walls salvation, and your gates praise. The sun will no more be your light by day, nor will the brightness of the moon shine on you. For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. The sun will never set again, and your moon will wane no more. The Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of sorrow will end. Then all of your people will be righteous, and they will possess the land forever. The shoot I have planted, the work of my hands, for the display of my splendor. The least of you will become 1,000. The smallest a mighty nation. I am the Lord. In its time, I will do this swiftly. The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, and joy, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. And they will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations. Strangers will shepherd your flocks. Foreigners will work your fields and vineyards, and you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be named ministers of our God. You will feed on the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you will boast. And instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion. And instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. That's what they desperately wanted to see happen again. That's what they were longing for God to return and to restore them, to redeem them and to forgive them and to show his face and kindness to them once again. And for 600 years, very little indication that God was ever coming back. So think about the despair that these people, in the time right before Jesus is to be born, think of the despair that they would have been feeling. They are living under the power, under the thumb of the brutal Roman Empire, one of the most brutal military regimes in the history of the world, and God's redemption must have felt 1,000,000 miles away. But they had bigger problems than Caesar 2,000 miles away on his throne. They had local problems with their local king, a guy named King Herod, who you may have heard of as you've read the biblical story. Herod was a Jew, but he had solicited help from a foreign power to claim his power and come into his throne. He had built massive monuments to his own name. And he even killed his own son out of paranoia that his son would steal his throne, even as Herod himself laid on his deathbed. And this is the same Herod who, after hearing that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, sent his soldiers to Bethlehem and said, "Kill every child under the age of 2." And it was done. Think of the despair of living under the rule of such despotic monsters, living in a land under a great shadow, feeling like God has abandoned you. God's people know what it means to wait. They had waited 400 years in slavery in Egypt. They had waited as God was leading them through the wilderness to the promised land. They had waited in exile with their city and their temple and their lives in ruins and ashes. They had waited. They knew what it was like. And I know today, some of you know what it's like to wait. You are waiting. Some of you are waiting for a diagnosis. Some of you are waiting for a cure. Some of you are waiting for a child to come home so that there can be reconciliation. Some of you are waiting for a partner. And maybe you feel like that person's never going to show up. Some of you are waiting for your circumstances to change. And when you're in the dark, it's hard to wait. It's hard to be patient. Because we all want to jump forward to where we want to be when everything gets worked out the way that it's supposed to be. We want to leave that in-between space where we are, and we want to get to where we're going. But you're not there yet. There's a space for that space in between. It's called liminal space, which is the time between what was and what will be. It's when you've left the familiar and you can't go back, but you're not yet where you're going and you feel stuck. Maybe you've tried to get out of this space on your own and you're doing everything that you can, but you realize now that you might be stuck in this season for a long time. Liminal space is a place of transition, a place of waiting and of not knowing. But liminal space is also a place where transformation happens. If we wait and if we let that space form us. Which brings us to a really important question this morning. What does God want to do in me as I wait? What might I need to learn in this season of waiting that I can learn in this dark space that I wouldn't be able to learn if everything was going the way that I planned? Sometimes when we're in a season of waiting, the people around us try to help. God bless their hearts. They're so unhelpful, aren't they? They don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand. And now listen, look, none of us sets out to say something insensitive to another person, but we're all really good at it, aren't we? We see somebody we love hurting and we think, man, if I could just offer a word to help them or a word of advice or I did this or my story turned out this way, then maybe that'll cheer them up. It'll help pull them out of this place that they're in. And lots of times it doesn't matter what they say. It doesn't help. They're not trying to be insensitive. The truth is, we just don't really have a clue what it's like to travel in each other's shoes most of the time. Our friends will try to encourage us out of that space. They'll try to give us advice that they insist is the key to escaping what we're feeling. But for those of you who've ever endured a long season of darkness, you know that it's not about positive thinking or sheer willpower or about tricks to get God to do what you want. There's really only one response to waiting. Here's the secret. Here's the key. And I wish it's something that you're going to enjoy hearing. I wish I could tell you there's a great book out there that you should read. There's a great method out there. Here's a method of meditation, or here's something that you can do, or here's a way you could change your diet, or here's all this stuff that you could do to get through the waiting. And at the end of the day, there's really only one thing that gets us through the waiting, and it's patience. Boy, I hate that answer, don't you? I mean, we're right back at the Christmas tree. I don't want to wait. I don't want to be patient. The root word for patience means to suffer. That's where that word comes from. Henry Nouwen says that in patience, though, what seems like a hindrance becomes a way. What seems like an obstacle becomes a door. What seems like a misfit becomes a cornerstone. And I think what he's saying is that the way out of suffering and out of waiting is not out, but through. Waiting is not passive. Waiting is active. It's a faithful reliance upon God. It's a willful choice that says, I don't know how this is going to turn out or if it's going to turn out at all, ever, but I know this. Today, all I have is you, and all I can do is hold on to you, God. That's all I've got. You're all I have. I shared in the first few weeks that I was here a little bit about the journey that Beth and I went through when we were trying to have children. And I want to share a little bit more about that journey. We, obviously, you know sort of the end of this story because you know our kids. We have 2 children. Grayson was born in 2012. We got married in 2001. So some of you aren't very good at math. That's 11 years in between. And in those 11 years, it was our desire to have children. And we couldn't. And we went to doctors, and doctors tried to give us answers, and they couldn't. And they tried to give us recommendations, and those things didn't work. And we tried this road, and the doctor said, that's not going to work. And we prayed about things, and that didn't work. And we were disappointed. And a month would go by, and we wouldn't be pregnant. And another month would go by, and we wouldn't be pregnant. And another month would go by. And we came to dread that time, month after month after month, a reminder that we didn't have our heart's desire. And during that season, I went through all of the different emotions. And you know, they have the different stages of grief where you've got denial and bargaining and anger and sadness and acceptance. And I went through all of that spiral like 10 times in those 11 years. And each time we cried out to God, God, please help us to understand. And God didn't give us an answer that helped us understand. And so over time, my prayer changed. God, please Please show me the road. Tell me where you want us to go, what you want us to do. And the result of that prayer was no direction. And so then I changed my prayer again and I prayed, God, just let me know what you want us to learn in this. I had already figured out, God, I can't manipulate you. I can't figure out how to get what we want. I don't understand. Just teach me what you want to teach me in this so that we can be done with this season. And you know what I heard from God in that moment? Silence. I think we hit rock bottom on Mother's Day. That was our favorite day, by the way. Hope you hear the sarcasm in that. We were in Dallas. I was doing youth ministry, and it was Mother's Day, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but we hated going to church on Mother's Day in that season. And this woman who was one of our youth ministry volunteers, just a heart of gold, a wonderful lady. She didn't mean anything by it. But she had just kind of realized that, wow, Mark and Beth have been married for a while and they don't have kids. And so she asked Beth, when are you guys going to have kids? I would love for you guys to have kids. You know, I had mine young and got it out of the way, and now I get to not be like really old when the kids are out of the house. And it was so great. When are you going to have kids? And Beth was gracious. I don't even remember what she said in that moment, but the conversation ended, and the woman went over to the worship service, and we were locking up the door to the youth building, about to head over to the service, and I turned and I looked at Beth, and we just looked at each other, and we were a wreck. And I would like to be able to tell you that what we did is that we went over to worship service, and we just poured ourselves out in worship, and we mourned, and we let people love on us. That's not what we did. We skipped church and went to brunch. Because sometimes when you're in a dark place, you don't always do the right spiritual thing. Sometimes you just put one foot in front of the other to survive. And that's what we did that day. And obviously, again, you know that our story ends in a very different way than some people's story. And we have two wonderful, beautiful children, and we're so grateful for that kindness that we've experienced. But I learned some things in that season. We had given up, and I had said, God, I don't even know. You obviously don't even want to teach me. So I've asked you what you want to teach us in this season, and you've said nothing. And so I'm just going to sit down right here in the middle of the road in my faith and in my doubt and in all of this, and I'm just going to sit here. I don't know what else to do. I'm just here, and I don't even know if you're there. I don't even know if you're listening. I don't know if you care about us. So I'm just sitting right here. And some people say, oh, I bet that's right when God gave you the desire of your heart. No, it was over a year later before we found out that we were pregnant. And so that last year from 2010 to 2011 was one of the darkest times. And looking back now, I realize that I learned so many things in that season. And the first is just how entitled that I was. I am a white male in America growing up in one of the most prosperous times in the history of the world. And I had no idea how entitled I was, feeling like I should always get what I want, until we went through this season and I learned I don't always get what I want, and there's no way I can manipulate God to get what I want. I learned that my picture of God as a genie who gives faithful people exactly what they want, that isn't really who God is. And I also learned that that's good news, that that's not who God is. And I learned that God wasn't just with me when I felt it and when everything was good. And I learned that God is sometimes silent, but that doesn't mean that he's gone. Even though I felt like he was. And I learned that God also knows what it's like to wait and to be in pain. Austin Fisher writes in his book, Faith in the Shadows, that God knows our pain is real and the God-forsaken silence can be deafening. God knows it can be too much sometimes. And God bless those who can't hang on long enough to see that the light at the end of the tunnel is redemption instead of a train. My God, why the silence when all I'm asking for is a whisper? You are neither the first nor the last to ask that question. And as Mother Teresa said, sometimes all you can do is ask it, and then stand like a very small child and wait patiently for the storm to subside. And as you ask and wait, Christ waits with you. Christ hangs with you. Because if there's anyone who knows what it feels to be forsaken by God, it's Jesus. And that's the hope of Advent. Not that everything's great all the time, but that this one who comes into the world as the light of the world will come to understand before the end of his life, and in the end of his life and in his death on the cross, he comes to understand what it means to experience God as silent and absent. And that's why Jesus is called God with us, because he understands. Where is God when we're waiting in the dark? Right next to us. Right by our side. It's often in the dark places where we least expect it that we find out just how much God's presence is with us. That the light is near, especially in the dark. And so may you know today that you are not alone. May you know today that although the darkness seems overwhelming, that the light is near. Because the light is Jesus. And Jesus has come into the world. And he is with us even now. I think that's why the table is so powerful for so many of us. It's not just because we remember what Jesus did a long time ago on the cross and in the resurrection. I think it's powerful for us because it reminds us that Jesus is here with us right now. And when we take this bread and this cup, we're reminded that he's in this with us, that the light is not far off, but the light is near and with us even in the dark spaces of our life. And so as you wait, and some of you have been waiting a long time, may you know today as you take this bread and you drink this cup together with others around you that he hasn't forsaken you. That God hasn't forsaken you because Jesus was forsaken in your place so that no one would ever have to be forsaken again. That's the gospel. That's the good news. And that's why we sing, and that's why we lift up our voices, and that's why we ask God to do again and again what we can't do for ourselves. And so he's with you today. And so the invitation is to come as we stand and as we sing these songs together, to come as you're ready and gather around the table with friends and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and parents in the faith who want to love on us and hug on us, and to be reminded that Jesus, the light, is with us. So let's stand and let's sing together and come to the table when you're ready.